I'm really super excited to introduce everyone to these alternatives. It is going to be a lot of information coming from these presenters. We're going to have the question and answer series at the end. We're going to reserve, let's see, I think it'll be 15 minutes at the end. So for those of you out in the audience, you're welcome to submit your questions. Jim, can you talk a little bit about how to submit questions in Zoom?
Sure, I can. So basically at the bottom of the screen, you will see there's a spot for Q&A, and then there's a spot for chat. So if you have a question that you want to ask the panelists that you'd like them to answer at the end, please put that question in the Q&A section, and that'll make sure that we build up a list of questions for the panelists. You can also use the chat button if you want to have a discussion with the other people who are in attendance at the webinar. So one thing I usually like to do is just to kind of test that it's working, is to have people go in the chat and just kind of say, you know, where you're logging in from around the world, just so you can kind of make sure that it's working for you. With the chat, you can also send messages, you know, directly to the panelists if you want to send something private. But in general, I would rather, if you have a question for the panelists, to put it in the Q&A section, and that will, it just kind of helps us build up a list for the end. Yeah. Okay.
Wonderful. And I neglected to introduce you, Jim Flannery, but he is the man behind the scenes helping this whole thing happen. We've also got Sarah Smith in the office. She's kind of in the background right now, but Sarah Smith has been working for MindFreedom for many, many years and is a fantastic contributor to the world of MindFreedom. We're both in Oregon, and you can get a hold of us using some emails that we're going to list at the end. So part of the intent of this webinar is to connect with those who are excited to work directly one-on-one with a mentor. Mentors are going to be provided by MindFreedom. And in order to do that, we want you to connect with Sarah Smith, and we're going to post her email in a poster at the end here. Without further ado, I think we're going to get started with our first presenter. So first up, we have Caroline. And Caroline has laid her head in a number of places, from Indiana jail cells to Texas psychiatric units. I'm from Indiana. Did I tell you that?
No, another Hoosier.
Yeah.
That's all right. Great. I'm sorry.
I know, right? The Midwest was so good to us. So now Caroline enjoys a freer existence as Director of Training for the Western Mass Recovery Learning Center community, the Western Mass Recovery Learning Community, and the National Hearing Voices Research and Development Project. A proud voice hearer and visionary, she has supported the development of Hearing Voices Network in every time zone of the United States. She founded the world's first online Hearing Voices group and one of the first long-term hospital groups in the United States. Caroline and her voices have been featured in the New York Times and Foreign Policy magazine. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amber. It's great to be here and to share about the Hearing Voices Network. I'm gonna see if I can share with you all some of my slides. Cool. So when we're talking about human rights abuses, when we're talking about forced treatment, one of the most vulnerable groups really that we see are folks that have voices, visions, and other anomalous experiences. So historically, there was even a guy that they gave a Nobel Prize. For what reason? Because he invented the idea of prefrontal lobotomy for folks who hear voices. And I'd like to say things have gotten a whole lot better, but as someone who grew up on like very heavy doses of neuroleptic drugs and was constantly told things like that I had a neurodegenerative disease, our treatment of voice hearers has not greatly improved. So the Hearing Voices Network provides a very important alternative. The Hearing Voices Network is not just Hearing Voices groups, though the groups are important and we're going to talk about those. Hearing Voices also represents a radical approach to these experiences that differs from the biochemical model. And it's also a human rights movement kind of in its own right. And like every great human rights movement, in the Hearing Voices movement, we have a powerful origin story. Usually rights are not freely given to us by those with power. And in HVN, it's quite similar. We have an origin story that involves a voice here, a courageous voice here by the name of Patsy Haga, that really lit the fires of this revolution. Patsy has a story that I can relate to. I'm someone, when I was in Indiana, I started hearing voices about the age of 5. Patsy's voices also began around that time. Patsy, like me, was a trauma survivor. She had been badly burned. In the beginning, her voices really weren't that big of an issue. It was as she got older and things in her life got harder and past traumas weren't addressed, that her voices got really aggressive and demanding. So Patsy ended up in the psychiatric system, as a lot of us do, but did not find the support there of, heavy medication, forced hospitalization, and being told not to talk about her voices. It wasn't helping her at all. And one day she had the courage to step to her psychiatrist. We have a painting of him here done by my friend Michelle Dalton. And Patsy famously said to Marius, she pointed to a crucifix actually that was on his wall and said to him, why is it okay for you to believe in a God that you can't see or hear, and I can't talk about the voices that I do hear? What's the sense in that? Because she had been told over and over by Marius he wouldn't speak to her about the content or tone of her voices because it would be collusion. And Patsy's courage in challenging him, finally he was willing to try, a new approach. He was willing to sit and explore with Patsy what her voices said. And this was really, this moment was really the origins of the Hearing Voices approach that acknowledged the reality of the experience and that the experience is meaningful. Because Patsy had an understanding of why she heard voices that was not that she had a neurodegenerative disease. You can read more about Patsy's framework. I don't have time to get into it. It's a very interesting book called The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Maybe some people on this call have read it. I'm not going to quite get into it. But for Patsy, it was how she understood her voices, and it was very important. Patsy challenged Marius a second time, though, famously, and said, you know what, dude, I like talking to you about my voices, but you don't hear voices yourself. I'd kind of like to talk to people that actually have. And he was pretty wary about that too, but eventually allowed folks on the unit to begin to discuss with each other their experiences. And he was absolutely amazed to see people that hadn't really spoken in years, that were just sort of sitting in the corner of the day hall, as I once did, all of a sudden, because they could talk about their experience, were laughing and engaging in really powerful ways. And those were the first Hearing Voices groups. Patsy actually famously challenged him a third time and said, hey, I love this. I love talking to people who hear voices, but I want to talk to people who hear voices that don't live in a hospital. He didn't even think such folks existed, but he was brave enough to allow Patsy to go on basically the Dutch version of the Oprah show and share some of her story. And they're like, hey, if you're watching today, if you're someone who's heard voices that other folks don't, why don't you call in and share your story with us? They figured just a handful of people would call in, but actually hundreds did just in that first hour. And what they learned that day, and also from subsequent decades of research to follow, is that voice hearing is actually incredibly common. And estimates of like 1/3 to 2/3 of voice hearers never end up interfacing with psychiatry at all. They have other frameworks of understanding, cultural and spiritual frameworks. You know, the experience is never difficult for them, and they just move on with their lives. So that final bit of the history is deeply important, because hearing voices groups that, you know, take place in community where everyone is allowed to have a different understanding of why they hear voices are our full charter hearing voices groups. And they have been profoundly meaningful for me as a voice hearer in making peace and moving through some really difficult experiences. So our history in the network has always, from its very beginning, acknowledged the reality of our experience. So for me, when I hear voices, I hear them outside of my head, a little bit over my shoulder typically, but sometimes from other areas. They can be quite loud. It is not of any use to me if someone says, that's not real, that's just a symptom, just ignore it. What's helpful for me is to be validated in the reality of my experience and have the right to talk about it. Our movement has always also valued voice hearer driven spaces where we can connect without clinicians, or, you know, there are people in clinical roles that facilitate hearing voices groups, but they are trained when entering into the group as an HVN facilitator to drop the values of the clinical role, drop that expertise, drop the clinical language. So even in those affiliated groups, they are non-clinical in the values that drive them. And finally, also, our movement has always presented not only an alternative to force, but also an alternative to this biochemical sort of mythology, since we don't have a lot of evidence that supports it, but that lens through which so many of us as voice hearers are expected to view our experience. We can look at it in many ways. And some of those examples I include on this slide, but it's certainly not limited to these. You know, I've been to many hearing voices groups. Sometimes we talk about government control, extraterrestrial communication. Some people in hearing voices groups identify as multiple, as different beings in one body, sometimes referring to themselves as a system, using the pronoun of they to describe their experience of multiplicity. And all of these are things you will find in a hearing voices group. And for me, this works quite well because, you know, I certainly have voices. Like I have a voice named Miss Kathy. She calls me Missy. She's kind of an angry lady at times. And I connect her very much to a trauma I experienced. But I also hear voices, like I have a voice named Shakina that is kind and guiding and sings to me. And for me, she is divine. She's connected to my spiritual understanding of the world. And in the Hearing Voices Network and in Hearing Voices groups, I'm allowed to have different frameworks for each voice that I hear. You know, my interpretation of my experience is what matters. And our groups are definitely guided by certain values. We're not rule-based groups like you would find on the typical, you know, psych unit group, but we have values and freedoms that are protected by the HVN USA Charter. So our charter, you can read it on our website. This slide offers just a few pieces of what you'll find in the charter. So hearing voices groups, they meet all over the planet. I facilitate a couple different groups. One, I do bring a group onto a mixed forensic unit where people stay often for many years, sadly, because of court order. there are also groups in Europe that exist in prisons and refugee detention centers. However, even if a group is in a prison, attending a Hearing Voices group is always, always voluntary. So for me, when I go onto a unit like the one that I do behind those double locked doors, it's important for me to facilitate the group opposite another group so that it's always a person's choice to engage in this movement of the Hearing Voices Network. And, you know, it's not like one of those groups where like the therapist is like, you need to stay on topic or you need to explore the symptom we're talking about today. No, we're allowed to talk about anything in these groups, which is very important because our voices, my voices, often connect to events in my life. And I want to be able to talk about my relationships. I want to be able to talk about my cat. I want to be able to talk about RuPaul's Drag Race, whatever I want to talk about. You know, this is a free space. And finally, challenging social norms should always happen in these groups. Even a group in a clinical setting, you should be allowed to challenge the social norm of mental illness. You should be allowed to challenge gender roles because strict gender roles, I know for a lot of people, impact their voices. You know, for me, I was socialized not to be angry. I had a lot more angry voices, you know, until I learned how to express my own anger. So challenging gender roles is important. Challenging roles, social norms around worth, like the idea that you have to make a lot of money to be important. All that stuff is important in these groups. And for many people, when you hear stories, Hearing Voices groups are the first time that they make real friends. They're community building. So I remember one time personally where I lived in a group home for a while. And I remember crying one night because I realized it had been a month since I had talked to someone who wasn't paid to talk to me and check in about my treatment goals. So I'm just checking on time. Okay. You know, for most people, like a lot of these groups are the first time you're like talking to people that actually 6 minutes.
That's what I count. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Where you're having real relationships. And it can really, having a real relationship that's not based on a treatment goal can really start to shift how you see yourself and build power. Again, these groups are non-clinical. Even if they are facilitated by someone who has clinical training, that training stays outside the door, which is why, you know, we recommend training for HVN facilitators. And a lot of it does involve some unlearning of language and ideas. So sometimes if you've had a lot of clinical training, there's a little bit more work to do around learning to hold one of these spaces and let go of that idea of sort of expertise or one way of looking at voices. All right. So when I was in the system, you know, I was asked like 2 questions about my voices. One, are you hearing voices, yes or no? And if the answer was yes, guess who got more Seroquel? Or sometimes I was asked, are they telling you to harm yourself or others? But really, that was it. But in our movement, it is about our voices are real and meaningful and have a context. But sometimes, you know, it helps to have people ask you questions about the experience to get there. Before I came to these groups, no one was asking me questions like whether my voices had a gender, whether they had names, when they first came along, whether they sounded like anyone I knew. So if you come to an HVN group or training, these are questions that you might see asked that would feel new, and so are radically different than, yeah, the typical offerings on a psych ward. Also really important, you know, in the Hearing Voices movement, it's not just about like making our voices go away. I don't think mine are going away, but I've found ways to like shift the power in the relationship. So I'm not going to be able to go through every single one of these things, like dialoguing with voices, texting a voice's power, making appointment with voices. If you're curious about this stuff, then you might be interested in taking like a facilitator training where we go through these things in depth. I'll give one example of a halfway compliance with the voice. One time I was hearing a voice that was telling me to kill myself, and it was really insistent, and arguing with it was not working. So what I did was I said to the voice, you know what, you're right. You're right. I should die and I should kill myself. And I'm not saying I won't, I will. But first I have to read every word of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And no offense to lovers of Tolkien, but I knew there was no way I was going to be reading those books. But the voice felt heard and acknowledged, and it bought me some time to figure out what was going on in my life that kind of needed to die, that the voice was trying to tell me. So these types of little strategies that we learn just going through life as voice hearers are things that you'll find in groups. Obviously, for most of us in the system, all we're given is medication. So a Hearing Voices approach is super empowering because, hey, not every one of these things works for every person, but it's about exploring and building power and doing it in community with people who have been there. So this is a map. I really encourage people to check out hearingvoicesusa.org. And I just realized that I have a typo in this slide. It says hearingvoiceusa.org. It should be Hearing Voices, so I'm sorry about that. So maybe Google, but you can find this map there. As you can see, there's pretty big pockets of the groups in New England. There's some pockets in the Pacific Northwest, and I wanted to share that this map is already out of date because there's a new group in Columbus, Ohio. Congratulations to them, meeting in a Burger King. So we'll add that to the group, to the map. And let's see, I'm probably running low on time here. So very quickly, just to mention once again, this is a global movement, and I remind folks of that. Every time I bring a group to the forensic unit, I say, hey, you know, when we're in this circle, we're in solidarity with a movement that's worldwide, even though we're locked in this hospital. So these are just some of the examples. And then, you know, every year there's a World Congress, Hearing Voices. Congress, it was in America for the first time last year in Boston. This year it will return to The Hague, where the movement began. So if folks ever have a chance to attend a World Congress, you can really learn a lot, because once you let go of this like assumption of illness, like this failed search for biomarkers for voice hearing, you can really explore a lot of powerful things. So I'm thinking my time is probably up.
Yeah, thanks so much, Caroline.
Yeah, cool. So that's my contact, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end.
Yes, thanks so much for providing your contact information. That's something we didn't talk a whole lot about, but with a really great work. This is an important network. Hearing Voices is a thing I think that all humans are born with. It's a matter of, yeah, there's all kinds of people out there, and I think that we just need to be together talking. It's a huge part of healing. Alrighty, I've got a couple questions brewing. I'll be brief, but what I wrote, I'm really glad that you're talking about human rights, Caroline, because I think that that's what's really at the heart of a lot of our need, is we need to be acknowledged for our human rights. If people are interested in developing human rights campaign that's new, of course, if you want to do something with Hearing Voices and you want to start up a meeting in a tea shop, absolutely do that and get on the map with Caroline. But also MindFreedom is offering the ability to connect one-on-one with a mentor who will give you their time and attention to help you get off the ground with a passion or an idea that you have. And that contact information for Sarah is going to be up at the end. I'll show a poster toward the end after the question and answers. And we're going to move on to Adrian. Hi, Adrian. So Adrian works at Santa Cruz's peer respite house. It's called SecondStory. Since its beginning 7 years ago, he has stood alongside many degrees of suffering, loss, and exhaustion. As a result of such human dilemmas, he has walked with each toward joy, bliss, hope, and possibility. Adrian currently serves as the manager of SecondStory. Hats tip to you, Adrian. As a program, SecondStory holds the ideal that people who have the least may yet gain the most. We have a thriving community. SecondStory works closely with provider community to offer a wealth of compassion and connection. What was new to the system is now integrated and held in the highest regard. On the side, Adrian works with others to build a new peer-run organization called the United Peer Movement. It is community activism at its finest. Thanks, Adrian.
No worries. Thank you for being here. I always balk at having to write in third person, but I guess it's a necessity at times in life.
We have it, yes.
I'm also grateful to Caroline for getting me started with the Hearing Voices group as well. So it's been going on in Santa Cruz for about a year now since I received the training more than a year ago. Anyway, thank you for being here, everybody. It's a pleasure to share this Sunday with you. And I'll go to my slideshow now. Well then, so the SecondStory alternative, I guess that's what this can be called. We were the first respite house in California. There's now about 4 and more in the works as well. I've been with the program since the beginning, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. I've been manager for the past 4 years. So I was about as succinct as it gets with my own journey as a peer. I've been a voice here for about almost 20 years now. And so it's been quite a journey and a lot of mistrust and terror. I spent some time in a board and care for, about a summer, and then was on Social Security Section 8. It's always not a negative either. There's got to be positive too. So I can name inexplicable states of bliss as something that is quite non-adherent to the way that the world works. But I definitely have been through some journeys, and I couldn't help but give a nod to my cat, who might just disrupt the conversation through her own curiosity. So I don't say that just to give any kind of understanding of myself, other than saying that when I found SecondStory, I became another life that became transformed by this organization, community, program, house, whatever we want to call it. It's really been quite a blessing to be serving for 8 years at this home. So there's the front of the house, and I'll get more into this later. But first, we're going to start with the how we started. So we started about 2011 when we applied for a SAMHSA transformation grant. The peer-run organization that we have in town was determined not functional enough to take on the responsibility of the management of the house. So we took the responsibility that was taken on by Encompass Community Services, which is essentially a provider organization in town. We had a very rocky start among staff, a lot of warfare, open, like trench warfare, what do we want to call it? It was not easy, I'm telling you. And none were free of the metaphoric bloodshed, including myself. It was really not a good time where we did not adhere to the principles of IPS or even of just, general decency towards each other. As the house settled down, it actually settled down pretty quickly once I once I stepped into the managerial role, things started to move much more evenly and calmly, and we began to be on the same side. We had to make a move. And then we got a CHAFA grant, which is the California Health Facilities and Financing Authority. A few of us, one researcher, myself, and the writer of the grant, went up to the CHAFA State Board to ask if we could get $3 million. $9 million was going to crisis residential programs, and because of our advocacy, we got $3 million allocated to peer crisis respites across the state for brick and mortar money. So as a result of this, we got a grant to buy this house, which is before us now in the picture, and we got $1.26 million to do it. The house currently is completely integrated into the system, and they're calling it a behavioral health system now, and so I'll keep it as current as I can. Coordinators love us. The provider organization that we work for is, we're the darling of the community. We started off not very, like, what's this peer organization thinking? Who do they think they are? What do they think they're doing? And then over the course of 8 years, we really wore them down, and the house is on our side. NAMI is on our side. It's just really a beautiful collaborative process. The way I see the house now is I would say it's a community organization, a community home program, whatever we want to call it, that everybody has a stake in. It doesn't just belong to the peer community, it belongs to all of us. So HSRI, Human Services Research Institute, I'll have a link at the end of that. We had 4 years as a result of SAMHSA transformation grant money to have research. So there's comprehensive research done for the first 4 years, which again will be pretty rocky. So the numbers may be not as high as they could be currently. I went the wrong way. Again, twice the wrong way on that. Let's go this way now. So steps towards building second story. The first thing we did was we started with local. This is the current home here, by the way. This is the kitchen area. We have 2 living rooms, and then I'll have a picture, I think, of it in the distance. But we started with peers and families approaching the local board of supervisors. They said, we need this grant money, go for it. Yana Jacobs was one of the original Sotiria house workers. She worked there for the first how many years of the program. So she basically wrote this grant at the request of the board of supervisors. Not thinking we're going to get this grant, we ended up getting it pretty easily. As a result of, we had an information gathering meeting where all the peers were in the room. We all said what we wanted, as much as a spa and like all kinds of things, basketball hoop, whatever else we wanted. We didn't get the spa or the basketball hoop, but we did get the grant, and the grant worked well. And we ended up getting, we needed within the grant was a client core. So I was asked to facilitate this client core organization, not really having any facilitating skills at the time. But I was just asked because I was basically a new face to town, or at least kind of found in my own hiding after graduating college. So we had a community meeting, which I believe I put in a link at the end, which Community TV recorded, just to kind of give people an idea of what the first discussion, the initial steps were of this. And the client core, we basically put together the foundation of the house, sort of the guidelines, the rules, who would be working there, trying to establish as much as we could. So we became also an advisory board for the county itself and beyond. So, and then eventually I think it was May or something, May 2011, we started within Encompass, and it's been a journey, I'll tell you. So when people are wanting to come into the house, usually what happens, if somebody's in distress, they give us a call. If we know them, it's great. If we don't know them, it's great too. We always start with a conversation, setting up a time to talk. Often enough, a coordinator will call us to check availability. And then they'll have the potential guest. We named, I don't know how we did it, but we came up with the name guest as somebody that's staying at our program. So a guest will call us if we have availability. The coordinators at this time even, they'll call us, and if we say, yeah, we've got space, when do they want to come in? I've done this before. It's like just going on autopilot. They'll say, no, we'll have them call you. We know the rules. So it's like we've got our coordinators working, with us to sort of like navigate this, the peer model of total choice, complete freedom to choose. So second story staff will confirm the eligibility. We have 4 eligibility requirements, where basically some form of housing, being a part of the system of care, which is specialty services at the county because the county's footing the bill, they want to make sure that their clients, I like using quotations at points, using the word clients, are receiving our services. So not being on a sexual predator list is not going to, it's going to be an immediate bar, and you have to be over 18 to get in. So an in-person interview, and we call it conversation as well, happens quickly. I mean, if somebody calls us, we can, if we have space, we'll have the interview, and then we'll invite people in as soon as we have space if we don't have a wait list. So when the person arrives to stay, it's the expectation is they'll stay up to 2 weeks, and sometimes longer based on varying extension criteria that we've established as a team and as a community, actually. So, and as I've said before, we really have built deep ties within the system itself. So why do people choose SecondStory? Obviously, the freedom to choose is one of the best options that I think that people will appreciate most. People will come to us when the intensity of their lives has disrupted things in a way that requires more than just sitting at home by themselves, perhaps, or whatever's going on in their lives. So to have such a comfortable space to heal in, where we're all working together, where we're all kind of seeing eye to eye, is really offers a lot of healing, a lot of reconnection, a lot of readiness to go back into the world. The warmth of the community that happens. People walk in and it's just like, it's magic at times when, you know, I go to work and I don't even want to not be there. I'm happy to be there. I enjoy being there. I leave often fully charged when I leave work instead of drained. Sometimes I'm drained, obviously. I mean, you can't get away with not being exhausted by work at times, but it really is a beautiful experience to get to know other people and and as a result of knowing other people, to know myself. So there's mutual respect from everybody that works there. I've consistently and you know, and almost we could call it ritually hired people who are coming from a place of love. And if people aren't coming from that open-hearted, soft place, is something I learned from Yana when it came to Sotiria House, is that Sotiria House back then they would screen people for the most loving, open-hearted folks. And so that's been my hiring method for the past 8, you know, I've been a part of every panel for 7 years now, I think. So almost always there will be a welcome return if the person needs us. Often enough people need us again. Sometimes there's occasions when people aren't going to be welcome in if it comes to violence or sexual assault, and it's or serious threat of violence or anything that gets people into, you know, law areas or something like that. Even then, we're still going to be willing to open the conversation again at a future date. Just depends on how egregious the problem can be. So at a given time, 6 people can stay with us. Because of the Chaffa grant, we were supposed to go to 8 spaces where people can rest, and we haven't gotten there yet. It's a work to be determined still. We have 2 single rooms and 2 double rooms. And so people can share rooms, people don't share rooms. It can be a struggle for who gets the single room often enough, but you know, and then we have to do the shuffle and everybody changes a bed. We've asked that people work with us for room changes. And when people leave also, so we're sort of like building in a different kind of identity of can do. I can do this. I'm able to do things. So it really is a process around people gaining skills. Costs to run the house have ranged between $550,000 and $750,000. We started at $750,000 and got it as low as $550,000. So we're somewhere in between that now with an expansion. And I'm smiling because my cat thinks that I'm going to have to give her attention, and I'm sorry for the disruption. But so the training grounds, we've got intentional peer support every year. We've had it every year. We've actually, as a result of our funding, I've insisted that other peer organizations in town also get funding. So NAMI peers and folks from the nonprofit drop-in center, folks from a different drop-in center in South County. So we definitely have created a completely open to a community intentional peer support training. I've been trained in Hearing Voices. That group has been going on for a year. We have people who have gone through the program who return to it. We've had people who have heard from coordinators that it's happening. So I spent a lot of time working with folks in the house while still facilitating a support group that has informed me unbelievably on my own, how I hear, how I'm a voice hearer myself, and how I relate to them, and how like just seeing all the patterns emerge. It's really quite fascinating. So mindfulness has been a part of the Encompass training, and it's been something that has transformed, I mean, you say terraformed our program into getting us more grounded in a momentary breath. Motivational interviewing and other trainings have happened as well. I'm currently a trainer for motivational interviewing, and I don't know how they looped me into it, but they did. I was most resistant to motivational interviewing, but they wanted me to be a trainer for all Encompass staff. So that's something that I've been doing on a pretty regular basis with a couple of other people. So when the community, when there's success and when we miss the mark as a community, we succeed when people walk in and experience immediate relief. Like they're in just a matter of moments, the guard, the defenses, the armor, just piece by piece is removed from somebody who feels welcomed and embraced by people in their community. People often open up about their life hurts and losses, and that happens very quickly as well. If things are going really positively, we're able to find a way to navigate the potential gains of community. Our team encourages and acts upon expressed needs. And so we have so when people are expressing what they need from life and what they need from the community, then they immediately start to embrace what they want in life. And people who had given up on school can find school again. People who had given up on work are thinking about work. People who want neither are just getting a respite. And that's golden too. We don't have any pressure to get things done or to accomplish anything. If people have a desire, we'll all work together to make it happen. Just like I said, so if rest were to happen, if that's all really somebody needed or wanted, then rest is all the people are going to need and get. And like, we're not going to really harm each other to make something happen. We believe in each other. I can't speak enough to what that means to us. We look around the room and we're all in it together. And then people recommitting to their lives, as I said. So when there's more work for all of us, it is usually substances. Substance use will create havoc for us. There's a typo there, creates havoc. Notice that. So then, like, substance is a big challenge for all of us in many ways. It was a part of my experience, though I didn't really get into the recovery model of things necessarily, but it definitely seems like substance and what we go through as lifetime distress or short lifetime distress, substances has played a big role in a lot of our lives. You can say the numbers are around 80% or something of people who come through our program. So honest, open dialogue is met with disrespect and lies. This usually comes from people thinking that they have to come into the program and get one over on the system, and being able to sort of do the dance that I've done myself, trying to get my needs met by having to approach it differently, and just trying to really navigate in a way that didn't create the optimal health for me. Leaving messes throughout the house has probably been the biggest challenge of it all. I mean, if I've seen anything, it's like people do not, and people at the house don't want to be treated like they're servants and maids and all of these things. So that can be contentious. It doesn't really cause too many problems. I just say, have you talked to the person directly? And then it's an ongoing dialogue, whether chores get done or not get done. People don't really get assigned chores. So it's just a chance for people we all try and do it together. I found the best way to get messes cleaned up in the house is for me to jump in and start cleaning. And then everybody else jumps in and starts cleaning with me. And that tends to be the least resistant path. So sometimes if it's not working, people just aren't ready. They aren't ready for the change in their life. Not that we're like the arbiter of change or anything like that, but we definitely offer a space for growth and opportunity. But if people aren't ready to step into that role in their lives, then it's just not going to happen so much. So team frustration results in power over. If people are frustrated, people generally fall back on having power over or something like that. And it's constant watch that I'm on to make sure that we aren't exerting power over others. And aggression and anger can be directed at each other. And it goes neither one way nor the other, that people are people. So advocacy. SecondStory started essentially, as I saw it, as an advocacy program. Eventually we wore down the systemic edges. So this is just, as I've said, we gradually won over the system. And we became a part of things. So as a result of wanting perhaps for SecondStory to be independent, perhaps to just start our own movement, we organized a few of us met for about 8 of us or 9 of us met for about a year in planning and developing of a vision statement, a value statement, and the name for the United Peer Movement. Another summit we created because several years ago we created a summit as a part of SecondStory. And so then we approached community stakeholders. We got grants. We got funded to make this summit happen. It was relatively pretty small, but in large part because of our level of fatigue and time. So we eventually approached SAMHSA and brass tacks, and so we got money to be able to work with. We got funding from SAMHSA to be able to work with Laverne Miller and Stephen Samra, and I've known them since the beginning of SecondStory, and we worked a great relationship with. They're ready to start on a nonprofit named United Peer Movement. If that's the name, we'll find out, to facilitate the process of a peer movement in Santa Cruz. So we're going to take a rest. We're going to take a rest from the past year, and we're going to reevaluate at the beginning of January whether we want to start up our own nonprofit and see what we can do within Santa Cruz County, maybe beyond. We aren't really thinking too much farther than that right now. Actually, we're not thinking too much farther than it's Sunday and it's sunny in California. So success is a failure and failure is success. I feel like we overextended ourselves, and it really is a beautiful way for me to learn how to continually generate energy towards a movement. And so for the past 8 years, this is even beyond 8 years, when I saw the movie X back in 1991 and started my whole campaign around advocacy in some way or other, story of Malcolm X. So I found that can't get caught up in what is success and what is failure. It's all success, and it can all be failure too. But as long as we gain the lessons and we're learning, we continue to further the movement in Santa Cruz and beyond. I don't believe in stopping in just one locality. I think that there's a hunger here for all of us to start changing the landscape of health and healing. So the future of the movement in Santa Cruz is in process, but the house itself can be in jeopardy just by not having peer certification. I've been pretty ambivalent around peer certification, and I still sort of am, because I don't know about billing. And so it's a question of whether the house goes on or not. Could be because we don't have peer certification in the state of California, because our services are not billable. So it really will be up in the air around those criteria. So as I've said, here's some resources. We've got community meeting television on community TV. We've got a platform on peer respites. We got the lead researcher. Do check out Bevan Croft's work here. She did a lot of work with us. And then the Mad in America video at SecondStory site. And I will stop there and thank you everybody for the past 20 minutes of life.
Thank you. That's really good information there. All right, I got a lot going on my screen, but I'm thankful for you, Adrian, and I'm glad that people are rolling in with questions. Some people have some questions in the chat, and I'd love to see those in the Q&A. It seems like some of them aren't making it to the actual Q&A portion, but we will figure that out. And I know, Adrian, you talked a little bit about feelings and needs, and I want to mention also the work of Marshall Rosenberg. And I just think that's a fundamental tool for connecting with people and just being in the place of human dignity and starting with exactly what's alive for us. I think that's really good work. And it's funny, I don't have a SecondStory to my house, but I do some of the same things. I want to just send all the beautiful artwork to paste all over the walls of the SecondStory community house because it looks really good and could be even more artistic. We've also got here with us Hilary Melton. Thanks for being here. So Hilary has 2 bumper stickers on her red Suzuki. One says Housing First, which is a model of ending homelessness to which she has dedicated most of her working life. The other says Nothing About Me Without Me, which speaks to her core values of individual choice and self-determination. She's also passionate about human rights, social justice, and building solutions that are research-based, effective, efficient, affordable, and replicable. She has 20+ years experience managing nonprofit programs, including the first Housing First project, kind of tricky, first Housing First project, founded by Dr. Sam Simbaris in New York City in '92. She has worked in shelters, street outreach, and administered support housing programs in New York City and Vermont. She's the founder and current executive director of Pathways Vermont, which has been providing housing and innovative mental health services in communities across the state of Vermont since 2009. Thanks for being here, Hilary. I'll switch the spotlight to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Amber. And thank you for including me in this webinar with these amazing people. I'm so grateful for everything that MindFreedom does to advance human rights and stamp out coercion in the mental health system. 20 minutes is not much time, so I'm going to skim the surface the best that I can. And please feel free to ask questions or email me with questions as well if you want. I'll start by giving you a brief overview of the organization that I work for, and then we'll talk more specifically about the history of Sotiria and our Pathways Vermont Sotiria House. I'm going to try to share my screen with you. See if that works. Is that working? You can see the screen?
You're good.
Yes, great, thank you. Hang on just a second. There we go. Okay. Pathways Vermont is a statewide organization. All of our programs support people experiencing mental health distress. We often meet folks when they're in the most difficult situations, whether they're coming out of prison or they're in a psychiatric hospital. They might be there against their will. They might be experiencing homelessness in the shelters or maybe on the streets. And at Pathways, we support people to live productive lives in the community. At Pathways, we practice a peer approach model in all of our programs. This means that we take the values that you see on this slide of peer services and apply them universally to all of our programs. This approach combats, we believe, combats discrimination as well as the us versus them paradigm that is so prevalent in the mental health services today. Pathways has almost 90 staff. Every year we do a lived experience survey because we value lived experience, and we want to make sure that we are who we are serving. Currently, 44% of our staff have experienced homelessness, 80% mental health challenges, 43% substance use challenges. We have 17 voice hearers and 21 suicide attempt survivors. These are our programs. We have both Housing First and Rapid Rehousing projects. We run a support line. Sometimes that's referred to as a, we run a support line. It's referred sometimes to as a warm line. It's a peer approach alternative to crisis lines. Our community center has employment supports, free Wi-Fi, free meals. We run groups there, like Caroline mentioned earlier, and also Adrian, Hearing Voices group. We have a Hearing Voices group there. We have an alternative to suicide group, drumming circle, writing circle, etc. And then there's our Sotiria house. Sotiria is a 5-bed residence for people experiencing what some people call first break psychosis. And since opening, we've served 30 people at Sotiria. We've housed in our housing programs about 600 households. We've answered over 32,000 calls on our support line and have had 18,000 visits to our community center. Sotiria. Soteria comes from the Greek word meaning salvation or deliverance. This guy, I don't know if you know him, Loren Mosher. Loren Mosher was an American psychiatrist, clinical professor of psychiatry, and director of the Center for Psychiatric Studies at the National Institute for Mental Health from 1968 until 1980. As part of his studies in the late 60s, he visited a place called Kingsley Hall in England, where Scottish psychiatrist Artie Lang was supporting people to navigate psychosis without medications. R.D. Lang rejected the medical model of mental illness. In 1965, Lang and a group of his colleagues got together and created a psychiatric community project called Kingsley Hall, where patients and therapists live together. The psychiatric world at that time, and still now, believed psychosis was unintelligible and it needed to be suppressed and controlled. Lang believed that there was meaning in people's experiences of psychosis. Lorne Mosher, when he visited Kingsley Hall, was very much inspired. Last year, there was a movie that was released called Mad to Be Normal. David Tennant and Elizabeth Moss are in it. It tells the story of Artie Lang at Kingsley Hall. It's a little Hollywoodized, focuses on the romantic relationship. One review I read said they didn't even think that relationship existed. Nonetheless, I think it's an interesting walking in to the environment that could have been Kingsley Hall. And I imagine what it must have been like for Lorne Mosher to go there and see something so radically different from what he was seeing and practicing in the United States. He came back to the United States, California. He's a California guy. He wrote a grant and received funding for treating people diagnosed with schizophrenia. It was a residential, home-like, non-hospital, non-drug treatment model for newly identified acutely psychotic persons, replicating a slightly Mosher version of Kingsley Hall. And in 1971, in San Jose, California, Sotiria House opened. These were some of the findings. There was a study and results. I think the important piece, and really the miracle piece that Mosher was able to do, because he had connections with hospitals, he was able to track two groups of folks. A group of folks that went to stay at Sotiria in a non-medical model that was about relationships, more of a psychosocial model, and he was able to track folks that had a traditional treatment in the hospital, meaning medication, neuroleptics. And he found that after the first 6 weeks tracking both of these groups, that they, in fact, had comparable results. So little to no medication and complete medication, and they were having similar results. And then at the end of 6 weeks, at the end of 2 years, he tracked folks for 2 years. He found that the Sotiria, they call them patients, Sotiria patients' outcomes were very much better than the hospital cohort. So people were getting jobs, they were living on their own, they had less hospital readmissions. And Mosher was excited about his findings. He said, people can recover from schizophrenia without neuroleptics. And he believed his findings would have a major impact on the way people diagnosed with schizophrenia were treated. Sadly, Sotiria lost its funding after 12 years in existence. Mosher believed the psychiatric industry was threatened by the results of the Sotiria studies and that the ideas were literally snuffed out. And there were at this time, it was also the 80s, there was this veritable tidal wave of pharmaceuticals in this country, resulting in almost exclusive focus on medication as the only treatment option. So fast forward 30 plus years to Vermont for people, we're on the other coast. I'm on the other coast from Adrian and Caroline. We're a little state, about 600,000 people nestled between New York and New Hampshire. We have a strong history of psychiatric survivors and advocates trying to create alternative treatments and community solutions. Our state hospital was first named the State Asylum for the Insane. It opened in 1891, and it started with 35 patients, and by the 1950s, there was 1,300 patients there. The hospital struggled with funding difficulties, and like many state hospitals, you practiced lobotomies, electroshock therapy, restraints, and seclusion. In 1985, they were decertified from federal funding, and they got their funding back from the feds. They were decertified again in 2003, and then again in 2005. The reasons they were decertified included elopements, suicides, and excessive use of force. For Vermont, being decertified meant that it did not receive federal funding, and they continued to keep the state hospital open with state dollars, and it continued to not get better. 2010, we had a very open-minded commissioner of mental health named Patrick Flood. And the state was in a time when they were quite actively looking at ways to close the state hospital and create alternatives. It was also a time of strong advocates in the state. There's Stephen Morgan, Laura Ziegler, Laura Sisson, if anybody knows them, and many, many more advocates. We had a state house that was open to closing the hospital and looking for alternatives. And this book was out, Mad in America. Robert Whitaker came to the state many times and lectured. We had legislators attend his lectures. The Commissioner of Mental Health attended. And this book was circulating, Sotiria. In fact, one of our advocates, Zinnia Williams, went to a MindFreedom conference and saw this Sotiria book, bought it, brought it back to the States, and she then passed it off to Stephen Morgan, who became a vehement advocate for creating a Sotiria house in Vermont. So all of these things were happening, and still we weren't getting any money commitments to open Sotiria. And then in 2011, Hurricane Irene hit, devastated many parts of the state, and also flooded the state hospital to the extent that it had to be evacuated and would not be opened again. So this legislature passed what we call Act 79 here in Vermont, which funded alternative programs in the community, including Sotiria House. Pathways Vermont, where I work, applied for and was awarded the grant to open this 5-bed Sotiria house. And a little less than 3 years later, after the funding was made available, we opened the house. And we opened it in Burlington, Vermont, which is our largest city. Much like the early Sotiria, we decided to keep the house in the community, not to segregate people, like send them off to the farm to get better and then come back and be in the community. We decided to have it in the old North End, which is, we're a small city. We serve individuals experiencing first or second break psychosis. We have 5 beds. Average length of stay is 5.5 months, though some people have stayed up to a year. Like Adrian's story in the beginning, we had some challenges, mostly about getting folks that had first break psychosis. People didn't know about us, and if you were hearing voices or seeing things, often you would go to the hospital, and the hospital didn't have much of a relationship with us then to be able to refer people. Philosophy. Artie Lang told this story that struck with me about his first job in psychiatry. He was an Army psychiatrist long before Kingsley Hall, and he talks about his first office. When he walked in, there was his office desk behind a very large, an office chair behind a very large wooden desk, and in front of the desk was the chair where the patient sat. And R.D. Lang said that one of the first things that he did was to take his desk chair and roll it around to the front of the desk so that he was sitting next to the people that he was serving, person to person. Mosher said of Sotiria that the idea was to treat people, as human beings with dignity and respect. The understanding is that psychotic thoughts and voices, rather than being seen as symptoms of a disease, might be meaningful and thus do not need to be suppressed, but should be explored. The essential ingredients for the Pathways Vermont Sotiria House are on this slide, and I'm going to go through them one by one. Home-like environment. When you hospital takes everything away from you, all of your personal possessions. It's cold. There are fluorescent lights, and the doors are locked. That is in stark contrast to Sotiria. Sotiria has a colorful, as you can see, our yellow and purple house. The inside is warm. It's full of natural light. Artwork is hung on the walls, made by both staff, residents, and former residents. There's comfortable couches, bookshelves full of books, internet access, houseplants, musical instruments. If you wake up in the middle of the night and you're hungry, you can go downstairs and raid the refrigerator. Choice. Sotiria is a voluntary house. You can kind of visit Sotiria and decide, interview people, decide if you would like to stay or not. There's no locked doors, no restraints or seclusion. And medication is by choice for whatever the resident chooses to do. We're not pro-medication, we're not anti-medication. We're about exploring all options for anyone's journey that walks through our door. Connection. Relationships are really the heartbeat of Sotiria. Mosher talks about being with versus doing to. Being with is the core therapeutic principle of Sotiria House. To be with someone is to walk with them, to not judge their experience, but to explore it with them. Being with at the house includes living day to day together, doing everyday things like cooking or cleaning or hanging out in the living room. One resident who came directly from the hospital said that when he first arrived, he couldn't tell the difference between staff and residents, and he found that truly remarkable. Community. All of our staff have lived experience of some sort: psychosis, trauma, substance use, hearing voices, etc. So there's an immediate sense of loving acceptance and belonging. Sotiria is a place to meet other people who have had similar experiences, who have survived, coped, and even prospered. Sotiria is definitely a place of hope.
Hilary, we've got 5 minutes. You're doing awesome. Thank you.
And after residents leave Sotiria, they're welcome to come back. We have a weekly community meal on Thursdays, and many people who've left Sotiria come back and stay connected to resident support staff or meet new residents and support them as well. I'll go back to a second. Katie, in that, the woman in the sunglasses there, that's our program director, Katie Bork, and Matt Cagle is our resident support staff. The tall one is Matt. This is our staffing pattern, our current staffing pattern. Like the original Sotiria, the frontline staff are non-professional. The nurse and the psychiatrist are part-time, and neither one is in charge. They're just consultants, and they're available if residents want to engage or if residents are interested in learning about medical things or psychiatric things. Qualities we look for in staff include, I like Adrian's love thing, that was nice. We look for a willingness to learn, curiosity, good communication skills, compassionate, flexible, creative, and of course, people with lived experience, particularly lived experience of psychosis is extremely important and helpful. This is the training that we do, and I'm not going to go into this here because I don't have time, but I just included this slide in case people are interested, and I'm happy to answer questions about it later. It's a lot. We do a lot of training. Intentional peer support is really the core, and is good partnering with the being with concept of Mosher and Artie Lang. No one day is the same at Sotiria. This to the right on the slide, it's a schedule, but we don't really have schedules. It's just an example of what maybe a day could look like. The house takes on the character of who's in the house at the time. You might have a group of people that are very athletic and like to kayak and climb mountains and go to the gym, or you might have a group of people that are wildly into cooking and crafting, or you might have a combination of the two, so that the house takes on the flavor of people that are there. If someone's having a particularly hard time, you know, the house melds to that as well. So far, we've served 30 residents. We're currently doing a video project, reaching out and interviewing former residents to see where they are and how they're doing. So stay tuned for that. To me, the concept of Sotiria is not really very complicated. Why not start the journey in an atmosphere of self-exploration and community versus prescriptive approaches and coercion? And it is definitely cheaper in the short run than hospital setting, and it's possibly could save millions of dollars in the long run by diverting young people from ever engaging in expensive, trauma-evoking hospital settings. That's what I got. Thank you.
Woohoo! Beautiful. Thank you. I'm so glad that places like SecondStory and Sotiria exist. I have a neighbor who's very fond of Sotiria House, and the fact that, you know, drugs are not a requirement, they are an option to help you if you need it, is really important offering. Thanks for presenting that. Okay, so we have a remainder 15 minutes, which is great because there's a lot of comments and questions, and we've got everybody here. There's going to be a recording of this webinar posted at mindfreedom.org. We also have hearingvoices.org, and we've also got Adrian and Hilary with their websites as well.
Yeah, it's hearingvoicesusa.org. I'm typing it into the chat box right now. Sorry about that.
It's all good. We've got a lot of information here. So we're going to start with some question and answer. This webinar has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you for your contributions, everyone. Our focus is on creating alternatives to forced treatment in psychiatry and mental health. So we have these fantastic examples of Hearing Voices Network, SecondStory, Respite House, and Sotiria House. And I'm going to kind of combine some questions and ideas that I'm hearing out there and really kind of address each of the presenters, what I think is maybe best answerable by you. And maybe we'll go in the same order here. For Caroline, some of the questions, I just kind of had wrote them down. What are the first steps to creating a Hearing Voices group? What are some things that go into that?
Yeah, for me and for a lot of people, the first step is to participate in an HVN training, to really learn about the history, the values, and you also get a chance to practice certain conversations. You know, I'm someone who, I hear voices. I've heard voices for 30 years, but it was great to learn more about other frameworks that people have, like technological frameworks is one example, like hearing from government agencies and practice, you know, holding space for folks and making sure that our groups really are making the wide HVN umbrella where people can come with all range of experience. We have a training coming up, but if you know that's not an option, the HVN USA board has also developed this cool self-reflection tool that you can look at to sort of like prepare yourself, you know, for holding the values of the group. And you know, to think about, you know, some of the things to consider is there's two types of Hearing Voices groups. There's full charter groups and affiliate groups. And, you know, the major difference between the two is the setting. So, yeah, so there's a number of things to consider, but those resources are on our website. And also just as a reminder, we have online Hearing Voices groups now. So yeah, they meet on the Zoom platform, which is exactly what we're using right now. And it functions just like a regular group does, except we're doing it like this over Zoom, and we can all see each other. And so if you know people that it is for people with lived experience with voices, visions, and all, you know, navigating alternate reality states, if you know anyone, that can't access a group in their community that would do it like this, all they have to do is email me or email hearingvoicesusa.org.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I had a question here for Adrian. I guess I'm trying to distill the questions in my mind. My brain's a little foggy with sinus infection, but how do you network about SecondStory advertising to clients, as it were, in the air quotes, is the first question for you. Like, how do you get the word out for people to take advantage of SecondStory's beautiful house?
When we first started it was difficult. It actually took us probably about, so when we started, let me think for a moment. When we started, we would go to all of the peer organizations and we'd offer proactive interviews or conversations where we talk to people at the South County place, at the drop-in center, at the Mid-County drop-in center, and other organizations. So then also we did a lot of work with the county also. They would do advertising. Their coordinators would get the word out to people about us, and then we also had gatherings where we'd have potlucks, and we'd have just basically getting people that we'd had those every couple of months. And so that was in the beginning, and it took actually, it wasn't until our team was set, until our team had gotten to a place of a lot of understanding of how to be in relationship with people in the respite environment, that once we gained our own expertise of our own self-knowledge and self-understanding as a community, then people just came to us immediately. There was no one there that was destructive or creating havoc. And then at that point, we'd done the groundwork, and then eventually we just became a brand in town.
Cool. Is the United Peer Movement, were you one who spoke about that as well?
Yeah.
Okay. And there was a question, is that centric to Santa Cruz?
Currently, no, it's centric to, it's essentially, it's with us now. And so when we started, we sort of, our initial goal was to let go of our expectations and just to take step by step. And so that meant putting in a vision statement and starting to take steps towards what the community needed. So when it came to a summit where as many came together that did, that we discussed what was needed in Santa Cruz. And so we basically, before any kind of movement can take root of the UPM, or the UP movement, we call it, is that we needed community input to make sure that there is a need for a peer organization or not a need, and what can that organization do outside of our own visioning that we had in mind. So that's generally what we've done. And yes, the idea at the beginning was, while shedding our expectations, was also that it could be something bigger than just local to Santa Cruz.
Yeah. Cool, thank you. Also, so Hilary, there's a question for you here. You mentioned Sotiria is only for first break psychosis and people affected by that. What about people with past experience?
With past experience of psychosis, it's not the model's target.
Yeah.
So we need, I definitely think in the system of care, we need a lot of different versions. We need a lot more community versions of detoxes, how to get off psych meds. People have been on for a long time. People have re-experienced psychosis maybe later in their lives. We kind of have to flip the funding from the medical model to, we need many more examples and variety of options for folks, because we like choice. People like to utilize services that resonate with them. So we have a lot of work to do, I think. We have to keep seeking out and keep organizing, from a cup of coffee with somebody else that resonates with you, to what Adrian's doing about creating a more structured group organizing. All of it's good.
Thank you. I'm going to skip around a bit. Hilary as well. the question, how did you find space? Like what were the logistics to actually getting a house to use for Sotiria? Maybe a little bit more of a funding conversation.
The funding, once Irene, God bless her heart, Hurricane Irene hit, the funding was easy in a way because, we weren't spending money on the state hospital anymore. Then it was finding, we decided to rent because we didn't know how it was going to go. And we found a landlord that was willing to rent to us in a community that was supportive. So that part, there was not, we didn't have community resistance or any of that. So it was kind of charmed. We were lucky.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, I think that there's some people sitting in the hedges out there that MindFreedom would just love to connect with. People who would like to just destroy unjust policies, institute new organizations. I think that these are really important models that are hopefully very replicable. So we want to skim through more question and answer here. Got about 5 minutes left. Ooh, it's my 5-minute warning. Let's see here. I want to hear a little bit more from Caroline about, I guess I just had the question around like how do you get on the map? And like, I know that some people even in Eugene are looking for lovely places to just post up and have conversations. Can you maybe tell us a few stories of things that people have done? I know you mentioned Burger King. I feel really excited about hearing these very grassroots developments.
Sure. So when it comes to getting listed on the map, really all that requires is a familiarity with the Hearing Voices Charter and a commitment to hold those values. So in the presentation today, we didn't get to go over every single value of the Hearing Voices Charter. It's important to both look at that and think about, how do I create that? How do I create a space where there's no assumption of illness? And that can look different ways. Certainly the setting of your group has a big impact on how you're able to hold the values and also the conversations that you have. So finding settings that are non-clinical as possible, or if you're like me, who, I also bring a group onto a locked unit because some folks would not be able to access that otherwise, being intentional about the space that I use and not having the group meet in a space that, clinical groups meet, so that when you enter into that space, you really feel, okay, this is more, this is where I'm connecting with my friends. This is where I can be myself. This is where I can really challenge and push back, not only challenge the content of my voices, but also challenge, what I'm hearing in treatment team from my psychiatrist about my voices.
Yeah. Oh, that's good stuff. I'm looking also at a question for Adrian. Right before I show this advertisement, I'm going to screen share in a minute, but I'm trying to go back to a comment asking about SecondStory House and how we deal with, what was it? Okay, I'm just going to ask this one I wrote down. How do you encourage people to open up in a meeting or sanctuary when it would be a big risk for them to just attend? And I think this is talking a little bit about introversion and how does that go at SecondStory House?
Yeah, I just want to think of how to answer. I know that when I was in the hospital, or outpatient programs, I was always put in the slow group because I didn't talk, because I wasn't able to speak. So, or I just was very silent for quite, through the most difficult times. So I think that just in what I learned from others is that, and from myself, is that it's very important that people have a place to be silent. And that if they don't want to speak, then it's just honor that space as well. And it's and the way that I've learned to see it is that silence can also say quite a lot.
Right. Yeah, it's so important to hold space for people who may not be super verbal.
And so and then in that space then is that there's less risk as a result of being able to be open to all types of communication. And so there's even our teammates, even staff, or even teammates can also come in with the silent communication as well. And there's no pressure to speak. There's no pressure to be something that you don't need or want to be. Or,
right.
and if speaking, if people feel safe enough or comfortable enough or whatever, I don't like safety as a word necessarily, but if people feel like they want to speak, the floor is always open. Actually, usually what will happen is people who are quieter often will have more credence to their words because they're saying less.
Right. Well, again, huge gratitude to everyone here. I think at some point we had 45 people in this meeting, and it's kind of tricky to be in a webinar and to speak to a void like this. So thank you for your hard effort and leaving up a poster here. That's some information that I promised. At the bottom, we have Sarah at mindfreedom.org. Please contact her if you're interested in starting something up. You have more questions, please contact presenters who have listed their contact information as well. And again, MindFreedom's offering free one-on-one mentorship from someone in the field who might know a little something about what you would like to put together. This isn't necessarily for starting an organization. This is just for starting a movement, maybe starting some sort of campaign that you really believe in. Thanks for being here, everyone. It is 3:30. We will conclude. Hope everyone has a great day. Happy Sunday.